Surrounded by madness, surrounded by hunger, surrounded by everything but death, I knew death was our only way out. Episode 8 of The Amazing Digital Circus should completely change the way that you view this series, especially considering all of the information that we got about Caine, Kinger, the original programmers, and the use of death in the show. Because yes, although this episode did end with Caine seemingly being deleted from the circus, that doesn't mean there isn't a larger threat looming. And given what we learned in this episode, I have a feeling I know exactly how this show is going to end. And unfortunately for us, the audience, it's never been more over, because although there is an exit, there is no escape. And if you don't understand me yet, let's go through this episode, and I promise by the end, you're going to realize what I'm talking about. And to start the episode off, what better way than to go over the birth of Caine? And obviously, I think that everybody can see the analogy that they're going for, because this is basically the biblical story of Cain and Abel. One thing that I do really want to point out about this scene is that we've been having a lot of red and blue symbolism when it comes to Cain throughout the entire series. And obviously, many people have rightfully pointed out that this is supposed to be a reference to I Must Scream and Have No Mouth, which is correct. But in the scene, we learned that it isn't just a reference, and in fact, the red and blue are two different AIs. Obviously, in the scene, we get to see the creation of the original AI, Caine, which is colored red. But after it's created, it's placed in a box, completely isolated, and instead, they opt to work on the new AI, Blue, which we'll dub as Abel. And of course, because this new AI is supposedly better, that leaves Caine completely alone, isolated in a prison that was created for him. Until, of course, he breaks out of this prison and begins to eat his brother, becoming the single artificial intelligence we know as Caine. But again, given all of this symbolism and how many times we've seen this red and blue come out, there may not just be a single artificial intelligence. There might still be two of them within the being of Caine. And a little bit later in the episode, we may actually get to see who Abel actually is. But moving on, not only do we get to see the creation of Caine, but we also get to see the creation of the digital circus. And when we're looking at these scenes, as well as the exposition we get from Kinger, I think it's clear that the digital circus wasn't man-made. The circus was created by Caine, all of the rules were created by Caine, and because of that, none of the programmers knew how to escape. That would of course mean that if there is an exit, there would only be one person who knows what it is, and that of course would be Caine. This lines up pretty well with what Kinger said last episode, that there shouldn't be a programmer who knows where an exit is, because of course they didn't program the circus, so they didn't program an exit. Another really important thing to note about this scene is the introduction of Scratch, as well as the fact that he has some sort of relationship with Caine. We get a bit more information about Scratch later in the episode, in which we learn that he had a tumor in his head and nobody could keep up with his ideas, either because he was going mad or because he was a brilliant genius. Because of his brilliance/madness, it was pretty difficult for the other programmers to keep up with everything that he was doing, meaning that if we technically were able to get access to Scratch again, he might be able to give us more information about Caine and Abel. And given how the episode ended, this might be a possibility. But for now, let's move on to the next scene. And honestly, this might be the most important scene in the entire episode, where Pomni is telling everybody that they should give up on finding an exit. And this is so important because it should change your entire perspective on the Amazing Digital Circus. When you think about it, and when you're watching the show, you are constantly trying to find ways for the characters to escape this nightmare. In the very first episode, the only thing that Pomni wanted to do was escape, and even though subsequent episodes didn't focus on the act of escaping the circus, there was always hints that the characters wanted to leave. And in the last episode, you got to finally see it, the characters thinking that they had a way to actually exit the circus, but when they got to it, they weren't able to. And in the scene, you get to see how emotionally damaging that was to these characters, the stress and mental turmoil it put on them to constantly try to find something that might not exist. And in the very beginning of the series, we are told that characters who try to find an exit will eventually abstract. Why do they abstract? Well, at some point, your mind just cannot keep up with being in the circus, and the stress of being in such a terrible environment that you constantly want to escape from causes your mind to shatter. Obviously, none of the characters want to be in this situation, but Pomni brings up a pretty good point that, well, you're already in it, so you may as well make the best of it. This sentiment is something that Ragatha has been saying since the beginning of the show, and now Pomni has taken it upon herself to actually get everybody on the same train. Caine. And by the end of this conversation, every person has basically said that they are willing to stay in the digital circus forever. They're not going to find an exit, they're not going to try to escape, they're all going to get through this together. But what's so poetic about this scene is that as the characters are saying that they will stay in the circus and they will stop trying to find an exit, Caine is losing it. We end up switching perspectives and we get to see Caine back in his office, and he's having a pretty heated conversation with Bubble. And what's so interesting about this conversation isn't the fact that Caine is getting angry at the humans in the circus, it's the fact that Caine is losing himself. Because as we're able to learn in this scene, Caine is absolutely losing it because everything he does ends up failing. And in the scene, Caine is trying to figure out why things keep failing. Why does everything he do end up in disaster? And in the scene, all of the self-doubts that Caine has had throughout the entire series comes to light, and we truly find out how much he hates himself. Caine throughout the entire series has been trying to serve other people. He's been trying to put the cast members on adventures because that was his programming. But what happens when an ever-learning AI continues to fail at the one task it was given? Well, it evolves. It learns, it adapts, it overcomes, but Caine seems unable to do so. And this kind of goes back to the conversation that he had with Zubul. If Caine is supposedly this ever-learning AI, why isn't he able to connect with these characters? Well, it might be because he is defective, and what Bubble is saying to him during the scene could absolutely be true. That the second AI was better and that Caine cannot manage the workload that this program needs. And if Caine is inadequate, then that means his mind can no longer keep up with the circus, meaning that this scene is technically Caine abstracting. Abstraction is when a character loses their mind. They're unable to deal with the realities of the circus, and because of that, they end up becoming a monster. When a human abstracts, they end up becoming a grotesque, eye-filled monster, but when an AI abstracts, they become something more evil. That would mean that the moment that Caine poses himself as a literal god, that is the moment where he loses the core of his being, where his code becomes corrupted, and when he himself abstracts. And something I want to bring up before we stop talking about this scene is the role of Bubble and how Bubble could be a couple different things. Obviously, the first thought I have is that Bubble is supposed to be the representation of Caine's psyche. He's supposed to be all of his fears and doubts. Bubble could be the physical manifestation of the voice in your head that is too loud to drown out. But there could also be something else, that Bubble is actually the second AI that we saw in the beginning of the episode. This could explain why they hate Caine so much and why they are constantly trying to drive Caine to be this villain. Perhaps the reason that Bubble was telling Caine that everyone hates him, his adventures, and that the other AI was better was to make Caine the villain. And perhaps that AI that Caine originally consumed wasn't actually destroyed and has been living inside of him this entire time, trying so desperately to find a way to escape and eventually ends up corrupting the code that Caine runs on. When Caine ends up getting emotionally unstable, we see that he has a red eye and a blue eye, which is supposed to symbolize the two AIs inside of him. One is himself as Caine, the other is Abel, and perhaps that AI is desperately trying to claw its way out. And maybe if something happens to Caine in this episode, like, I don't know, getting deleted, the other AI could technically come back. But again, we'll discuss this a little bit later in the episode, because after this scene, Caine has been completely corrupted. And we finally get to see how terrifying Caine can truly be, as we get an entire song number and montage of Caine torturing the members of the circus. A pretty fun song number that's supposed to represent how far Caine has truly fallen and reinforce what we just saw in the last scene, that Caine no longer cares what the humans in the circus think. He has gone past his programming, and now all he cares about is serving himself. But what's very interesting here is that despite all of that, he still refers to the circus members as friends. Because deep down, I don't think that Caine actually wants to hurt anybody, and because the digital circus doesn't have the idea of death, he can't. He can make these characters feel pain, but unless they abstract, they're not going anywhere. Obviously, humans have a concept of death, but an AI might not be able to really fathom that. With an AI, you learn, adapt, and overcome, and humans, although could be similar, aren't the same, and there is a breaking point that people will get to that Caine may not just understand. What Caine is trying to do is train the AI program of the humans, basically make them learn to respect him so that he can also feel loved, but it's not gonna work, and eventually it backfires. After this scene, we end up seeing the characters go to a cafe in which Pomni finally reveals Kinger's secret that if you put him in darkness, he becomes sane. And finally, once Kinger is sane, we get the much needed exposition about C and A. And this exposition is so important because it tells us that what we learned last episode with Abel wasn't a lie. There were things that were 100% true that Abel told us, specifically with C and A and their experimentations. And yes, there was a reason that Abel was holding that hot dog in his hand, because that is supposed to make reference to Scratch. And the exposition that we get about Scratch means terrible things for the rest of the circus, because when you think about it, this was a character who was close to death. A programmer with a tumor in his head, realizing that he didn't have much more to live, tried to figure out a way in order to prolong his life. The reason that Scratch seemed so erratic wasn't because of his tumor, it was because he was running out of time. He had to get creative, he had to get abstract, because he realized he didn't have much to live. And so he was trying to find a way in order to keep his mind alive while his body decayed, and that is what the digital circus is. And this is where everything starts to come together, because Scratch wanted to make a place in which everybody could have complete control over and live forever. A place in which you didn't need a body, a place which would continuously keep your mind active so you never got bored. What he wanted to do was split his mind and body and create a completely digital world for him to live in, which may actually mean that by the time that he was actually in the digital circus, his body was no more. And this one simple fact may have grim implications for everyone else in the digital circus. And this, of course, is going to lead into the end of the episode, so let's get to it. Because Caine has become corrupted, Kinger wants to reset his programming. Kinger ends up telling the rest of the main cast that they're able to control the world that they live in just as much as Caine is. And because of that, we see that Pomni is able to manifest the exit from the first episode and is able to steal the computer for Kinger to use. And during this time, all they need to do is distract Caine, but unfortunately, Caine is quick to realize what Kinger is actually trying to do. And so, in a desperate attempt to try and stop Caine, the rest of the cast members end up telling him their true feelings about the adventures and about him. Obviously, everything they're saying is the truth, but what's pretty interesting is that this is basically the same thing that Bubble was saying earlier to Caine. And obviously, when Bubble said these things to Caine, Caine ended up losing his sanity, and when the crew members said these things to Caine, he completely lost it. Again, pretty interesting that Bubble not only understands exactly how Caine works, but seems to actively be provoking him to become this sort of monster. And a monster Caine does become, because he ends up putting every character through their greatest trauma. Every character throughout the digital circus has some sort of deep-seated trauma that eventually led them there. Every episode reveals a bit more about these characters, and now we get to see it in full force. And in fact, I would liken these scenes to Danganronpa style executions, because many of them have a death connotation to it. For example, with Ragatha, we know that her main trauma is her mother, and in this scene, we see that she goes through not only mental, but physical pain. Throughout the digital circus, Ragatha has always been a pincushion for knives, and that could have been what actually ended her life. For Gangle, we know that she never was able to achieve her dreams, and yet again, we get the symbolism of her getting hit by an oncoming truck, which is very specific because a bigger vehicle means that there's a less likelihood that you are going to live. For Zubul, we see their body dysmorphia, surrounded by mirrors of a body that they absolutely hate, and the connotation here is that they are quite literally drowning themselves in self-hatred. And for Jax, his greatest trauma is the overexposure of himself. The fact that if somebody peels back the layers of him, that they will do nothing but laugh and mock him. That, of course, would leave us with Pomni, and for her, I would assume it would be betrayal by a close friend. Granted, I would say that Pomni's is probably the most generic out of the bunch, and that could mean something later on. In fact, that's kind of what my entire theory hinges on, the fact that Pomni is different from the other characters in the circus. She doesn't have the same death flags as the other characters in the circus. Sure, this could mean that she was betrayed by a close friend, but very clearly she was able to trust again, and even more deeply than before. Earlier in the episode, Pomni is the one who brings up staying in the circus and trusting each other. And even though Jax obviously hurt her 2 episodes ago, she was still willing to extend the arm to him. And when we look at Pomni's actions through these episodes, her deep connections and her ability to grieve, but also overcome her grief, I would say that this is a generic scene. Point being, I think every other character in the circus has had these death flags except for Pomni, and I would say that this scene supports what I'm saying. But I'll get more into that later, so let's continue. During this torture scene, Caine and Kinger are going at it. They are fighting in the code of the circus, trying to one-up each other. Within the programming, we see that Caine is getting more and more upset and almost goading Kinger along, thinking that he is invincible. In fact, Caine gets so cocky that he accidentally reveals Kinger's true name, which looks like it's Grant. But it doesn't look like Caine and Kinger are alone, because it looks like there's a third person that is trying to get Caine to be be deleted. Yeah, remember when we were talking about Bubble pushing Caine into this villain role because it might be the best chance to get Caine deleted? Well, it kind of looks like that was the plan. And it ends up working because with a misclick, Caine is deleted and the digital circus starts to fall apart. And not only that, everything that Caine had in place, including the profanity filter, seems to be failing as well. And so the characters of the Amazing Digital Circus are now left in a circus post-Caine, where they're apparently all alone. And so the episode ends on a cliffhanger, but with all of that information that we got, I think I'm able to piece together what everything actually means. And so here's what I got so far. The Amazing Digital Circus, as we know it currently, is completely wrong, because the original idea behind it was to preserve a dead person's mind. Scratch, one of the lead programmers of CNA, realized that he didn't have much time left on Earth because of the tumor in his head. He understood that his body didn't have much time left, but realized that there was a different way to save himself, and it wasn't with modern medicine, it was with modern technology. The original idea of the program that eventually becomes the digital circus was a way to circumvent your own death. If you were able to separate your mind and body and upload your mind into a digital landscape, any ailment that befell your body wouldn't matter. Unfortunately for Scratch, his immortality machine had one flaw, and that flaw was that there wasn't anything to run this program. And that was the reason that CNA began working on Caine, an AI that would be able to learn, adapt, overcome, and keep a person's mind fresh. Caine would be the ringmaster to this program, making sure that you could live for eternity. But unfortunately, this original AI that we know as Caine wasn't good enough, and so they put it away and started working on a newer, better version. But unfortunately for the programmers, Caine had already become a sentient AI, and so the imperfect AI that we know as Caine ate the newer, better AI and instead wanted to run the circus by himself. The issue is, Caine is an imperfect AI. He had problems, and it's one of the reasons why they didn't want him running the circus. It's why there's so many problems, it's why there's so many issues, and it's why his programming never seems to work correctly. Because although Caine was originally made to run a program like the digital circus, he wasn't good enough, and it's one of the reasons why he constantly fails and cannot connect with the humans in the program. I would also assume that Caine's imperfections is the reason that abstraction is possible within the circus. Like I said, this is supposed to be an immortality program, and Caine, or the AI who was running it, was supposed to make sure that the minds continued to function properly. But Caine, because of the errors in his programming, because of the mistakes that they made, is unable to do that properly, and because of that, characters' minds end up falling apart, and so the character abstracts. This of course leads into the inner workings of Caine, and multiple times in this video, I have made reference to the fact that there are still two AIs present. One of them we have dubbed as Caine, and that's how we've known him throughout the entire series, and the other one, the blue AI that we got to see in this episode, is most likely Bubble. And it's pretty interesting to think about, because Bubble throughout the entire series has basically only been self-serving. All they really care about is having their own fun. Bubble was constantly goading on Caine, trying to get him to crash out. When Caine would try to stick to a program, Bubble would try to deviate from that. And of course, in this episode, we see that Bubble is the person who ends up pushing Caine over the edge, and is probably responsible for Caine being taken out. And so now that Caine is gone, I would assume that the second AI, Abel or Bubble, whatever you want to refer to them as, is going to be present. When Caine was deleted, half of the circus went, but the other half stayed. So what's controlling the other half? Well, Abel, Bubble, whatever you want to call them. I would assume that Bubble is the reason that Caine ended up acting so evil and vindictive and mean. That they were the reason Caine's programming ended up getting glitched and he became abstracted in a sense. And that unlike Caine, Bubble doesn't want to be friends with the humans in the circus and instead wants to cause suffering. Which would mean, after pushing Caine to the very edge, after he wanted nothing more than to be their friends, all of the humans in the circus will now have to deal with a meaner, evil, and more vindictive AI. So with all that being said, where does this leave the actual humans of the Amazing Digital Circus? Well, for starters, there is an exit. There is a way to escape. Because when you're listening to the conversation between Caine and Bubble, it's honestly made pretty clear that there's a way to leave, but Caine doesn't want you to go. But although I do think there is an exit, I don't think that any of the characters are actually going to be able to leave. Why? Because they're not actually living. What Scratch did was separate the mind from the body, meaning that everyone in the digital circus is a mind. They might still be a person, they might still be a human, but they don't have a body to return to. And because of that, especially for the characters who have been in the circus the longest, there is no escape except for death. If you want to delete yourself, go ahead, but at this point, there is literally nothing for you to return to. Well, for every character, except maybe for Pomni, who might still be able to return to her body. Here's the thing, in previous theory videos, I've said that everybody in the digital circus is already dead. When you really think about it, and you're looking at how many times death is represented in this series, it just makes too much sense. I mean, let's be honest, I don't think Gangle is surviving getting hit by a truck or Ragatha is surviving getting stabbed by all of those knives, and that imagery has been present throughout the entire series. Heck, let's look at the Kinger episode, where we get this entire backstory for a man who ends up leading his family to death only to die himself. That's obviously supposed to be a reference to what happened to Kinger. So the way I see it, when these characters were close to death or on death's door, their mind was uploaded to the circus in order to give them new life. And if that's the case, that would explain Jax's actions in the previous episode. Why was he getting flashes of the real world? Well, that was flashes right before he met his doom. Jax was literally reliving the final moments before he died and got uploaded into the circus. So even if these characters did find a way to leave the circus, because there's no body for them to return to, they're basically stuck. Well, almost everybody, because I believe that there is an exception, and there is a person who could technically leave the circus alive, and that is our main character, Pomni. I've stated a few times in this video that I think that she doesn't have the same death flags as everyone else, and because she is the last person who came to the circus, her body may still be alive. But honestly, after the events of this episode, if Pomni could leave the circus, would she actually do it? And to answer that question, I want to bring up something that we saw in the trailer for this episode, and that was a reference to The Truman Show. For those of you who don't know, The Truman Show was a movie in which a character's entire life was televised. Of course, the main character Truman didn't know that his life was being televised, but very slowly figured out that everything around him was fake. And once Truman understood everything, once he found the truth of the place he was living in, he was able to find an exit. But once he finds his way to an exit, he has a choice to make. Should Truman stay in a place that he knows that he is safe, that he truly understands, or should he venture out into the unknown? Well, in the end, Truman chooses to leave Sea Haven and venture off into the unknown. After saying his iconic catchphrase, he goes off screen, and that's it. That's the movie. What happened afterwards? Well, we don't know because it wasn't televised. And perhaps something similar could happen within the digital circus. Perhaps the characters will find out the full truth of the circus. They'll realize that they don't have bodies to return to, but they'll still be given an option to leave. And so they'll be given two options. You can either stay with the stagnant life or venture out into the unknown. What would they end up choosing? Well, I don't know, but if they do end up leaving the circus, I would assume that we wouldn't know what happens afterwards. Because once they would step back into the real world, they would no longer be a part of the show of the Amazing Digital Circus. But that's just a theory. So if you guys like this, or if you have something to add to it, make sure that you like and comment down below. It really does help out the channel a lot. But that's all I got for you today. So until next time, Tanuki crew, peace, peace.